I never saw the knife coming. 1 second, I was walking to my car, my phone clutched in my hand as I texted my father, letting him know I'd be home late from work. The next, a rough hand grabbed my arm and yanked me back into the alley. Panic surged through me. My heart slammed against my ribs as I struggled. But he was stronger. I barely had time to scream before the cold steel of a blade pressed against my throat. "Don't fight." A voice snarled in my ear, the stench of alcohol thick on his breath. "Just hand over your purse, phone, and let her go." The deep, commanding voice cut through the night air like a gunshot. My attacker stiffened. I barely managed to turn my head before I saw him. A man standing at the entrance of the alley, his posture calm but menacing. He was tall, built like someone who knew how to fight, and there was something in his dark eyes that made my attacker hesitate. "Mind your business," the man holding me growled, dragging me closer. The knife bit into my skin. I whimpered. The stranger took a slow step forward. I said, "Let her go." Something about him sent a shiver down my spine, but not in fear. There was something dangerous in the way he moved, the way his hands clenched into fists. My attacker made a mistake. He hesitated. The next second, the stranger lunged. It happened so fast I barely had time to react. A fist connected with my attacker's jaw, sending him stumbling backward. I gasped as I was suddenly free, my knees buckling beneath me. The two men clashed violently. My rescuer fought with a brutal efficiency that was almost terrifying. His movements were precise, controlled, like he'd done this before. A well-placed strike to the ribs sent my attacker crumbling to the ground, gasping in pain. "Go," the stranger ordered me without looking back. I should have listened. I should have run. But I couldn't move. I was too stunned, too shaken. Instead, I stared at my rescuer, my breath hitching when I saw the scars on his knuckles. His jaw was tense, his expression unreadable. And then, as if sensing my gaze, he turned toward me. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough, low, concern buried beneath something else. I swallowed. I think I'm okay." He studied me for a long moment before nodding. "Good." Then, without another word, he turned to leave. "Wait," I called out, stepping forward despite my trembling legs. "Who are you?" He paused, glancing at me over his shoulder. In the dim light, I saw something flicker across his face, something haunted. "No one." And just like that, he walked away. I should have let him go. I should have just gone home, called my father, and forgotten about it. But something about him lingered in my mind. Something about the way he moved, the way he fought, the way he looked at me. And I had no idea that meeting him would change my life forever. I stood there, my breath shaky, my pulse pounding in my ears as I watched him disappear into the shadows. Who the hell was he? The alley was eerily silent now, except for the occasional groan from the man on the ground. I didn't spare my attacker another glance. My legs finally found their strength, and I forced myself to move, clutching my bag to my chest as I stumbled back toward the main street. I should call the police. I should call my father. But my mind wasn't on that. It was on the man who had just saved me. The way he fought with precision, like he had been in more fights than I could count. The way he looked at me, guarded, like he wasn't used to people asking who he was. A chill ran down my spine, but it wasn't from fear. I finally reached my car, fumbling with my keys. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped them. I bent down to grab them, only to see a pair of worn-out boots a few feet away. My heart jumped into my throat. I looked up. It was him. I should have been scared, but I wasn't. I could see him more clearly now under the glow of the streetlight. He was young, maybe in his early 30s, with dark, slightly unkempt hair and sharp, unreadable eyes. His jaw was rough with stubble, and there was something about him, something hardened, something broken. "You followed me," I said, my voice coming out more accusatory than I intended. His expression didn't change. "Making sure you get in your car safely." I swallowed. He had no reason to care, no reason to stick around after what he had already done for me. "Thank you." My voice was softer this time. For saving me back there. His eyes flickered with something unreadable before he looked away. Forget it. I couldn't. The weight of what had almost happened pressed down on me, and before I knew it, I blurted out, "Can I do something for you?" "To thank you." He scoffed, shaking his head. "I don't need anything." He started to turn, But I wasn't done. At least tell me your name. His shoulders tensed slightly before he muttered, Logan. Logan. It suited him somehow. Rugged, strong, like he'd been through more than most people ever would. I'm Claire, I said. He gave a short nod. Go home, Claire. And with that, he walked off, disappearing down the street like he was just another shadow in the night. I stood there for a long time, staring after him, feeling something stir inside me. I didn't know what it was yet, but I knew this wasn't the last time I would see him. The next morning, I sat across from my father in his grand office, my fingers tightening around the coffee cup in my hands. You were attacked. His voice was sharp, controlled, but I knew him well enough to hear the fury underneath. Yes, I admitted. His lips pressed into a thin line. My father, Richard Harrington, was one of the most powerful lawyers in the country, ruthless in the courtroom, feared by enemies, and completely intolerant of anything that threatened his family. Why didn't you call me last night? He asked, his piercing eyes locked onto mine. I handled it, I said, knowing that wouldn't satisfy him. A man helped me. His jaw twitched. A man. I knew exactly what he was thinking. My father didn't trust people easily, especially men who lurked in the shadows and mysteriously intervened in situations like mine. Yes, his name is Logan. He scoffed. And who is this Logan? I hesitated. I don't know, but he saved my life. That doesn't mean he's trustworthy. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Dad, not everyone has an agenda. He leaned forward, his steely gaze pinning me to my seat. You're naive if you believe that, especially about a man who appears out of nowhere in a dark alley. Did you consider he might have been watching you? That he might have staged the attack? I stiffened. That's ridiculous. Is it? His tone was cold, calculating. Men like that don't do things for free, Claire. They always want something. I gritted my teeth. I knew my father was protective, but this was too much. He didn't want anything. I shot back. He didn't even stick around long enough for me to thank him properly. My father studied me for a moment before leaning back in his chair. I want his name looked into, he said finally. I clenched my fists. Dad, I won't stop you from finding him again, he said, his voice dangerously calm. But I will know exactly who he is. I exhaled sharply, knowing there was no point in arguing. Logan had saved my life, and now my father was treating him like a suspect. Something about that didn't sit right with me. I found him 2 days later. It wasn't hard. I had a feeling Logan wasn't the type to stray far from familiar places. After asking around, I discovered he was working at a mechanic shop on the rougher side of town. I parked outside, gripping the steering wheel, debating whether I should even go inside. I had no idea what I was even hoping to accomplish. Finally, I forced myself out of the car and walked in. The smell of grease and metal filled the air, and the sound of clanking tools echoed through the garage. And then I saw him. Logan stood near the back, wiping oil off his hands, his shirt slightly unbuttoned at the top, revealing a scar across his collarbone. For some reason, my stomach flipped. He turned, and when he saw me, his expression darkened. What are you doing here? I hesitated. I wanted to see you. His eyes narrowed. Why? Because you saved me. Because I can't stop thinking about you. Because I feel like there's something I need to understand about you. I didn't say any of that. Instead, I squared my shoulders and met his gaze. Because I owe you a proper thank you. His jaw tightened. I told you to forget it. I took a step closer. Why don't you want anything in return? Something flickered across his face. Something painful. Because I don't deserve it. His words hit me harder than I expected. What does that mean? I asked softly. But before he could answer, someone else spoke. Hey, Logan, your parole officer is here. My stomach dropped. Parole officer? I turned back to Logan, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. I suddenly realized why my father's investigators couldn't find any information on him. Because Logan had just gotten out of prison. Prison. The word echoed in my mind, louder than the sound of the tools clanking around us, louder than my own heartbeat. Logan didn't say a word. He didn't even flinch, like he was used to people finding out, used to the way they looked at him afterward. I wasn't sure what expression I had on my face, but I knew one thing. I wasn't scared. His parole officer, a stern-looking man in his 50s, strode into the garage, nodding toward Logan. We need to talk. Logan barely spared me another glance before muttering, Stay out of trouble, Claire. Then he turned and followed the officer out. Just like that. Like I was just some girl who stumbled into his life, and he wanted me gone before I asked any more questions. But that wasn't going to happen. I wasn't sure why I cared so much, but something told me Logan wasn't just some criminal who got out of prison and didn't deserve a second chance. The way he saved me, that wasn't a man who belonged behind bars. I needed to know more, and I knew exactly where to start. I went home and did something reckless. I used my father's name to get access to Logan's record. It wasn't hard. Being the daughter of a powerful millionaire lawyer came with certain privileges. I had spent my whole life hating how people treated me differently because of my father's name, but this time, I used it, and what I found made my stomach twist. Logan had been in prison for 7 years, charged with assault and battery. But the details were strange. The official report claimed Logan had nearly beaten a man to death in a bar fight. But something about it felt off, especially because the victim was a high-profile businessman with connections to some very powerful people. Something wasn't right. I sat back, staring at the screen. 7 years for a bar fight. That seemed excessive. And then I saw the last note in his file. Good behavior. Released early. No known family. No prior record. Logan wasn't a career criminal. He wasn't dangerous. He had a past, but it wasn't the kind of past my father would claim made him a threat. So why did I feel like the real story hadn't been told? I found Logan again the next day. This time, he wasn't at the mechanic shop. He was sitting on the steps of a run-down building, a cigarette between his fingers, staring into nothing. He saw me before I even said a word. You really don't listen, do you? His voice was rough, but there was no real anger in it. I crossed my arms. Nope. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. What do you want, Claire? I took a deep breath. I looked into your record. His eyes snapped to mine, dark and unreadable. That's not your business, he said, his voice lower now. Maybe not, I admitted, but I don't believe it. Something flickered in his expression. Believe what? That you nearly killed a man for no reason. He let out a humorless laugh. Is that what it says? That's what it claims. I corrected. But I don't think that's the whole truth. He went silent. I stepped closer. Tell me what really happened, Logan. For a moment, I thought he was going to push me away again. But then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. I did beat him, he admitted. But I didn't start that fight. My pulse quickened. Then why did they arrest you? His jaw clenched. Because he had power. He had money. And I had nothing. I swallowed hard. What did he do? Logan hesitated. And then, with a voice so low I almost didn't hear it, he said, he hurt someone I cared about. Everything inside me stilled. Logan wasn't some violent criminal. He wasn't some reckless man who lost his temper in a bar fight. He had protected someone, and he had paid the price for it. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about him. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying our conversation in my head. He had been in prison for 7 years for protecting someone, and the system had let him rot. I clenched my fists. I had grown up seeing the inside of courtrooms, watching my father tear people apart with nothing but words. I had learned early on that justice wasn't always about truth. It was about who had the most power, and Logan had been powerless. But he wasn't anymore. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but one thing was clear. I wasn't done with Logan, and I had a feeling he wasn't done with me either. The next day, I confronted my father. You knew. He looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. Excuse me. I dropped the file on his desk. Logan's file. You knew this wasn't a simple assault case, I said. You knew the man Logan attacked was someone powerful, someone corrupt. My father leaned back, exhaling slowly. Claire, the world isn't black and white. No, I shot back. But you let an innocent man take the fall. You let him rot in prison while the real monster walked free. His expression darkened. I don't make the laws, Claire. I work within them. I felt sick. All these years, I whispered. I thought you fought for justice. His jaw tightened. Justice is a luxury for people who can afford it. I stared at him, suddenly seeing my father in a way I never had before. And I realized something terrifying. Logan had spent years behind bars for trying to do the right thing. And my father? He had spent his whole life defending the people who put him there. I walked out of my father's office with my heart pounding, my hands shaking. Justice is a luxury for people who can afford it. His words echoed in my head, filling me with a rage I had never felt before. I had always known my father was ruthless. I had seen him dismantle opponents in court, twist laws to suit his clients, and walk away without a second thought. But this was different. This wasn't just a case. This was a man's life, and my father had let it happen. I got into my car and gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I needed to see Logan. I found him in the same place as before, sitting on the steps of his building, staring off into the distance. He didn't look surprised to see me. "You look pissed," he muttered. I let out a breath, trying to control the storm inside me. I talked to my father. His jaw tightened, and I hesitated, then said, "He knew." Logan let out a bitter laugh. "Of course he did." I sat down beside him, the cool evening air wrapping around us. "He let it happen," I whispered. "He let them throw you away like you were nothing." Logan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I already knew that." My stomach twisted. All these years, he had carried the weight of that betrayal, knowing that the system wasn't built for people like him. "I want to help you," I said suddenly. He turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "Help me how?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But you deserve more than this." More than. I gestured to the rundown building, the worn-out boots, the weight in his eyes. More than what they gave you. Something in his expression shifted, something unreadable. And then, for the first time, he smiled. It was small, barely there, but it was real. And I knew then, no matter what it took, I wasn't walking away from this. I spent the next few days digging. I went through old court records, police reports, anything I could find. And what I found made my blood run cold. Logan hadn't just beaten any man. He had beaten Daniel Cross, a billionaire's son, a man with a long history of violence, covered up by money and power. I found police reports buried under settlements, victims who had tried to speak up only to disappear into silence. But Logan had fought back, and he had paid the price for it. My father's words haunted me. Justice is a luxury for people who can afford it. Daniel Cross had afforded plenty of it, and Logan had lost everything. I confronted my father again. "You defended Daniel Cross," I said, throwing the files onto his desk. He barely looked up. "I did my job." I slammed my hands down. "Your job?" "Your job was to keep a monster out of prison while an innocent man lost 7 years of his life." He met my gaze, calm and unreadable. "Claire, you're emotional." "I'm right." He sighed. "Do you think this is the first time something like this has happened? The system isn't fair. It never has been. That's not an excuse." "No," he agreed, "but it's reality." I felt my heart breaking. For years, I had idolized my father, believed he was one of the best. But now, I wasn't sure who he was anymore, or who I was. I went to Logan's apartment that night. He opened the door, his eyes scanning my face. "You found something," he guessed. I stepped inside, my chest tight. "You were right," I whispered. "Daniel Cross, he's done this before. 12 times. My father defended him. He helped bury the evidence." Logan didn't react right away. Then he let out a slow breath. "I already knew," he said. My heart twisted. "Then why didn't you fight harder? Why didn't you?" "What?" His voice was tired. "You think I didn't?" I screamed. I begged. I punched walls until my hands bled. None of it mattered. Because people like Cross, they don't lose. I swallowed. "But they should." For the first time, he looked at me differently. Like I wasn't just some rich girl who had stumbled into his life. Like maybe, just maybe, I was someone who could change things. We started planning. I used my father's contact against him, pulling files, finding people who had been paid off. Logan, despite everything, had connections too. People who had been in prison with him. People who had seen Cross for what he really was. We weren't going to take him to court. We were going to ruin him. Expose every secret, every victim, every crime that had been buried under money. And this time, there would be no more silence. The night we released the evidence, Logan stood beside me, watching the world burn. News outlets ran with the story. Social media exploded. Victims came forward, no longer afraid. Daniel Cross tried to deny it, but money couldn't buy silence anymore. And my father? He looked at me like he had never seen me before, like he knew he had lost me. Maybe he had. Logan met me on the rooftop of his building the night it was over. "You did it," he said. "We did it." He exhaled. "I don't know what happens next." I looked at him, really looked at him. For the first time, his shoulders weren't weighed down by a past he couldn't escape. For the first time, he was free. I smiled. "Then we'll figure it out." And this time, Logan wasn't alone. The aftermath was more chaotic than we expected. Daniel Cross had vanished from the public eye. but his empire was crumbling. Lawsuits piled up, former victims speaking out with a confidence they had never been allowed before. His father, the billionaire who had shielded him for years, was now under investigation for obstruction of justice. And my father? He hadn't spoken to me since the night everything came crashing down. I knew he saw me as a traitor, his own daughter, working against the very system that had made him powerful. But for the first time in my life, I didn't care. I had done something that mattered. And Logan? Logan was free, but freedom didn't come with a guidebook. I found him one evening, standing on a rooftop, staring at the city below. "They're talking about reopening your case," I said. He didn't turn to look at me. "Too late for that. It's not too late to clear your name." He finally glanced at me, his eyes unreadable. "And then what? What'd I do with my life, Claire? I've been a prisoner for 7 years. I don't know how to be anything else." My heart twisted. "Then let's figure out together." He exhaled slowly. "You keep saying that." "Because I mean it." For a long time, he didn't speak. Then, quietly, he said, "I've never had anyone stick around before." I reached for his hand, squeezing it lightly. "Get used to it." For the first time since I met him, Logan didn't pull away. Weeks passed, and the world moved on. Daniel Cross was charged. His father tried to buy his way out, but the pressure was too much. The powerful family that had controlled the courts for years was finally falling apart. Logan's name was finally cleared. But even with justice, the scars remained. One night, I found him outside the mechanic shop, staring at his hands. "I don't know who I am without the anger," he admitted. I sat beside him. "Then don't be just anger." He exhaled. "What if that's all I have?" I shook my head. "You have more. You have me." His jaw tightened, like he wasn't used to the idea of someone caring. Like he was afraid to believe it. "I don't deserve that," he muttered. I tilted my head, studying him. And yet, here I am. He finally looked at me, something raw and vulnerable in his gaze. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "What if I don't know how to be someone worth keeping?" I smiled softly. "Then we take it one day at a time." Logan had lost years of his life, but he wasn't lost anymore, and neither was I. Months later, I met my father in his office. It wasn't a warm reunion. "You're still angry," he noted, pouring himself a drink. I folded my arms. "I don't think I'll ever stop being angry." He nodded slowly. "And yet you're here. I wanted to tell you something." He raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" I took a deep breath. "I'm going to law school." That made a pause. "You?" "Yes," I said firmly. "Not to be like you. Not to protect people like Daniel Cross, but to fight for the ones who don't stand a chance in your world." He studied me for a long moment. Then, to my surprise, he smiled. Not a proud smile, not a warm one, but a smile of acceptance. "You're not a little girl anymore," he said simply. "No," I agreed. "I'm not." I left his office knowing we would never see the world the same way. But I also knew that, for the first time in my life, I was truly my own person. And, as I walked outside, where Logan was waiting for me, I realized something. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning.